In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day. I'm guessing that that's not an unfamiliar part of the Old Testament, even to the youngest kids sitting up here. By the way, this is great. Don't y'all love this? Thanks so much for coming sitting down here. I really appreciate that. And for the mothers who are panicked that one of your kids is going to be bad, it's okay. We'll all survive. So don't be fretful tonight while they're sitting down here. I really appreciate y'all doing this. This is probably not just a very familiar part of the Bible to us, maybe the most familiar part of the Bible. I think probably this was the first Bible story I was ever told. Can you remember the decorations on the wall that laid out the days of creation with the day and a picture that would remind you what happened on that day? For those of you who are a little older, do you remember the flannel graph with the pictures of what happened on each day, right? Greg even led, thanks for doing that song. That was just completely accidental that you led that. You want to do it again? The day one song, the creation song. Y'all already sang that this afternoon. That was great. It's a story that we're very familiar with, one we've been told our entire life, that it all began in the beginning with God creating. Now, I need to tell you something about that story. Number one, you should not believe that story just because it's what you've always been told. That's not enough reason to believe it. Secondly, you need to know that there are a lot of people who do not believe that story, who do not believe that what is said in Genesis is how it really happened at the beginning. In fact, they would say that the story we just began in Genesis 1, they would say that it is a creation myth. And that any person with half a brain who knows anything about science would know that that's not the way it really happened. In fact, the deeper you get in your education, you guys are going off to college, right? In a year. Mom's freaking out about that, right? In a year. If you guys get into your sciences, you're really going to begin to get a lot of pressure about this. Take biology, take chemistry, and a lot of emphasis is going to be placed on the theory of evolution. And if you speak up in class, we'll say, well, I believe what happened back in Genesis. I think that's the way it happened. You may get laughed out of the classroom. A lot of people don't believe the Genesis story is true. Now, let me tell you what that means for all of you and all of us. It means that we need to know that the story is true. We need to look at the story of Genesis, and we need to look at the evidence, and we need to use the logic and the reason God gave us. We need to use our brain, and we need to know because of the evidence that what we're told in Genesis is true. We need to examine the story carefully and examine it by the evidence so we can confirm that it's true. And I'm not afraid to tell you that. I'm not worried about how this is going to shake out. Folks, I think the evidence is on our side. In fact, just last week, I had a young lady tell me that when she went off to college, she grew up her whole life hearing this story, but when she went off to college, she said, look, I'm going to hear the other side, and I'm going to listen to what they have to say, and I'm going to examine the evidence, and I'm going to believe what's true. Well, guess what happened? She examined the evidence, and she walked away saying, that's the story that's true. I'm not worried about how this comes out when people are honest with the evidence. So we're going to need to make sure that what we've always been told is true. But I'll tell you something else we're going to have to do. We need to spend some time looking at the other story. We live in a world that is full of all kinds of amazing things, all kinds of complicated systems, all kinds of amazing living creatures, plants, and animals. And every serious person ultimately has to look at that and say, where'd all that come from? How did that come to exist? And if Genesis is, as they claim, a myth, if that's now not how it happened, then we didn't know what their story is. How do they account for it? And you know what? They have a story. And for a little while tonight, I want to do something a little different. I want to talk to you about their story. We spend a lot of time in Genesis. For the time you were little bitty kids, you've been learning about what happened on day one, right? Well, what's their story? And how does it look when you put it up next to the evidence? I'll tell you what I think you're going to find. I think you're going to find their story is a little hard to believe. And sometimes it defies logic, that often it is unscientific, and occasionally it's downright silly. But I don't want you to take my word for it. I want us to spend some time tonight looking at their story and how it compares with the evidence. For the high school kids, apologies in advance, because some of this will be review, because we've been talking about this in the high school class. I'm doing that on purpose. I hope that moms and dads with teenagers in that class will be prodded by what we talk about tonight to have some follow-up discussions at home, because I'm going to tell you something, brothers and sisters, our kids' faith is under an unprecedented assault. And they need to know why they believe what they believe. They need to know Genesis is true. And they need to know what they're being taught about origin in most science classes is not true. It's the second part that I want to focus on tonight. So, if the other side has a story, what is their story? I think if you pose that question, what you'll probably hear is this. They'll say that their story is evolution. Or more exactly, their story is macroevolution. And that distinction or that clarification is really important, because everybody believes in evolution. And someone sitting there saying, I don't. Yeah, you do. And if you don't, you need to, because animals do adapt to their environment. They do change. They do evolve. But understand that other story. That other story that's being told involves a whole lot more than just animals changing. What the other story involves is animals changing into other kinds of animals. In fact, that's how the story goes. Life began a long, long time ago in some puddle on planet Earth. We'll talk more about the puddle a little bit later tonight. And you had little simple life forms that ultimately over billions of years evolved into fish, and then fish into reptiles and lizards into birds, until ultimately we came out of all of that. That's the story, basically. And that's how our world came to be filled with all these living things. You ever seen this before? Older folks seen this before? It's a depiction of Darwin's tree of life. And if you look at the tree, you can see what I'm talking about. Down here at the bottom of it, you have these simple life forms, and then this tree begins to grow and bloom, and ultimately all life evolved in just that way. Now that tree looks a lot different than Genesis, right? That story about everything starting out simple and gradually evolving into more complex things, that's way different than what we read about in Genesis, when the Bible says God essentially created all living things all at the same time back at the beginning. But you're going to be told that there is a mountain of evidence that says this is the way it's happened. And if you believe Genesis, well, you're just not very smart. Now, I want to tell you the truth about that. The truth is that there is no evidence that this happened. Someone says, someone has sent David to school because he clearly didn't get science. That may be true, but that doesn't change the fact that there is no evidence for this. Someone says, but wait a minute. When I open the science textbooks, there's a lot of evidence presented there about finches and fruit flies and peppered moths and all that. You've seen this before. It's in the textbook. I got one in my library. It has pictures of all that stuff in it. Whenever in science class they start to give you evidence that they say proves this, you need to pay very careful attention. Because usually, all their evidence proves is that animals can change, not that they can change into other kinds of animals. I showed the slide to the high school class this morning. This is the difference. If you look on the left side, this happens, folks. Sadly, this happens. I don't know why they did that, and apologies if you have a Labradoodle, but you got an ugly dog. They take this, and they breed it with this, and they come up with this. That happens. That's a different looking kind of dog, right? There's evidence that you can do that. We don't have any evidence of that. You see what I'm saying? And they've tried. They have been tormenting poor fruit flies for decades, tweaking those things, trying to get them to change. They've got some freaky looking fruit flies with feet coming out of their head and all those kinds of things. But I promise you, when you look at them, guess what they look like? They look like fruit flies. Just like you can breed put different dogs in these boxes and come up with some goofy looking thing on that side. But I will tell you, still going to have 4 legs and a tail and ears, and you'll be able to look at it and say that's a dog or a fruit fly or whatever. We can prove animals can change. That's not what evolution is about. Evolution is about this right side, that this kind of animal can eventually change into that kind of animal. And listen, the smartest minds on the planet have been working in the most advanced laboratories trying to recreate that kind of change that they say the mindless forces of nature did all by itself. And they can't do it. I think there's some reasons for that. We talked in class today about genetic limits. I think the problem is in the limits that the DNA places on it, but the bottom line is they can't do it. What's the point? There is no evidence for this. And there ought to be. If not in the laboratory, certainly in the dirt, there ought to be evidence. There ought to be a record in the fossils. You see, a theory is one kind of animal gradually evolved into another kind, right? So if that's what happened, if their story is true, what should we expect to find in between here and here? Think about that. If fish gradually evolved into lizards, then we ought to expect to find fossils of some kind of critter that down here looks a lot like a fish, but maybe he's starting to look like a lizard. And then as we move on up a million years or so, a little more like a lizard, a little more, until ultimately starts looking like that guy more and more. That's how it ought to work. We ought to find in the fossils examples of that kind of change. In science, they call those transitional forms. In fact, if this is what happened with all living things, start processing this. How many examples of these things should we find? Folks, you sometimes hear folks talk about the missing link. It's not a missing link. It is millions and millions of links to tie these two critters together, okay? Guess what? We don't have any. I shouldn't say that. You're going to open your textbook and you're going to see a picture of this guy. This is Archaeopteryx. It's supposed to be an example of a missing link, sort of a link between reptiles and birds. So he's sort of a dinosaurish looking bird. He looks kind of like a bird, but he's got some dinosaur characteristics too. And they would say, well, there you go, David. Here's an example of a missing link. One of the billions we ought to have, right? One problem. Not all the evolutionists agree about that. And some of them will say, that's not a reptile, that's just a really weird looking bird. You see, if they can't even agree on it, what do they expect us to think? So what do we have? Genesis says that God created all living things at essentially the same time. By the way, that fits really well with the fossil record. And that all those animals reproduce after their kind, which is, by the way, what we see today. That's what we can observe scientifically. That's what Genesis says. Genesis agrees with science. It agrees with the fossils. The other story says that one kind of life gradually evolved into another kind of life, which is the keystone of their theory, and there's absolutely no evidence for it. They can't do that in the laboratory. There's nothing in the fossils. Question, which story should you believe? Which makes more sense? Which has more evidence or science to back it up? You see what I'm saying? And folks, that's the key to the theory. It stands or falls with this. But can I just pause and complain for a minute? I think we give them too much when we agree that we'll talk about finches and fruit flies and fossils. I think we need to back up for a minute and talk first about how you get living things to exist at all. Before we talk about how they evolve, let's get them alive to start with. So let's back a step up, turn a page, and look at another chapter in their story. We'll call this chapter Spontaneous Generation, or How Dead Stuff Starts Living. According to their story, all of this began billions of years ago on early planet Earth in a puddle. So we found a picture with a puddle up here. That's where it all started. But hit the pause button, because we've got to talk about something before we talk about the puddle. The question is, how did that puddle come to be in a place where life can exist? That is not uncomplicated. Before we can talk about the puddle, we've got to understand how this whole list of very narrow conditions came to exist on this planet that allow life to exist. We call those very narrow conditions what? Say it, it's okay. Anthropic constants. I'm so proud of my teenagers. I was sorry, Roy Rubin, they wouldn't come up with that. Anthropic constants. It's actually a field of science that studies the exacting conditions like gravity and oxygen and atmospheric transparency that have to be set exactly right so life can exist on this planet. And see, in fact, you see, Earth's kind of like a spaceship. You ever wonder why when we send men to the moon, we've got to create spacecraft? Someone says, you really didn't do well in science. It's because they can't live out in space. And that's right. And so the brilliant scientists at NASA construct these spaceships that are like little bubbles in space that have all the things human beings need to survive. And that way we can send a guy to the moon and back. You realize Earth is just like that? It is exactly like, well, it's way bigger. It's a spaceship not for 3, but for billions. But it has all these exactly, perfectly set conditions so that people can live inside this bubble floating around in the vacuum of space. How did it kind of be that way? I mean, just perfect so that we could live here. I got to tell you, there are some atheists who don't believe that could happen like by accident, like Sir Fred Hoyle, who is a famous astronomer and an atheist who studied these anthropic constants, these perfect conditions that allow for life. Here's what he said about it. I want you to look at this quote. He said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, and he added chemistry and biology. That's the ... what's missing there. And that there are no blind forces of nature worth speaking about. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Do you see what he says there? He said, it cannot be that nature created this perfect place all by itself. This atheist said some super intellect had to set all this up just right. Now, his super intellect wasn't God, it was the aliens. We'll talk more about them a little later. But what he agrees with is that nature couldn't do this all by itself. You understand that we're not even talking about how life began. We're just talking about having a place where life could begin. And one of their own is saying, couldn't happen by accident. And I agree with that. That part of the story is just too hard to believe. But let's go back and talk about the puddle for a minute. What about that puddle where life started? Well, as chance would have it, they say, everything needed to make a life, all the chemicals, were in the puddle. Just happened to work out that way. You also kind of laugh because that's humorous. And the chemicals were not just present, but they were all put together in just the right way so that that first cell could come to life. Now listen, that's what Darwin thought, the guy who popularized this theory, Charles Darwin. But understand that when he said that, he had no idea what was going on inside a cell. He didn't have electron microscopes. He couldn't peer into the inner part of the nucleus and see the DNA. Darwin didn't know anything about DNA. You realize that the DNA in an amoeba has more information in it than 1,000 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica? And that information is important because it tells the cell what to do so it could do its function in the body and live. That's kind of important. Where'd that data come from? Who put that code in all the different, and it's different for different kinds of cells because they have different functions. Who put the code in each of those cells to make them do the things that they do? I told the kids this morning about Dr. Dean Kenyon. Dr. Kenyon is a professor of biology at the University of San Francisco. And back in the late 60s, he actually wrote a college textbook called Biochemical Predestination, where he defended the theory of evolution. And he was teaching his theory to his classes at the University of San Francisco when one of his students challenged him with this question: who put the coding in the DNA for the first life? Who put that thousand volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, all that information, who put it in the first living cell so that it could do its thing? And he said, that really bothered me. And so I began to try to figure out some kind of evolutionary way for that to work. And he said, I researched and I studied, and in the end, you know what I figured out? It couldn't happen. Nature can't do it. Dr. Kenyon is a young earth creationist now, still on the faculty at the University of San Francisco, and I might add, has caused them a good deal of grief because of his conclusions. He's not the only one. There are a lot of evolutionists with the discovery of DNA who are seeing this problem. Nature just couldn't do this. And so they're looking for other answers. If you watch the movie Expelled, and if you haven't, it would be a great movie to watch with your teenage kids. If you watch the movie Expelled, Ben Stein interviews Richard Dawkins, the most famous atheist in the world, not a very bright guy, but one of the most well-known atheists. And in the interview, Dawkins suggests a way to explain how that information got in the cell. He suggested that maybe the aliens did it. And one of the new very popular theories is that long ago, billions of years ago, aliens visited planet Earth and seeded Earth with these first simple life forms, and they had all the DNA coded, and that's how it all got started. The aliens did it. Two observations about that. There is no evidence for the aliens. You realize that, right? That's a just so story. They're just pulling that out of thin air. Forget about Roswell, New Mexico. We don't have any evidence for the aliens, okay? And second, why aliens and not God? Absolutely no evidence for aliens. They say the same thing about God. Why believe in aliens but not God? And you know the answer to that, right? Because if there's a God, I'm obligated to do what he said. These aliens, unless they show up with a phaser and put it to my head, I don't have to do what they say. You see. So what do we have? Genesis chapter 1, verse 11. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. Genesis says that we know how all these living things came to live, that an all-powerful creator created them. Which, by the way, is a reasonable way to explain how DNA got coded. To say that an infinitely powerful creator coded the DNA is a reasonable explanation. It makes sense, it's logical. The other story says that the mindless forces of nature, working without thought or purpose, put it all together, all the conditions necessary for life, put the right chemicals in the puddle, organized them correctly, coded the DNA, and brought it to life. Or the aliens did it. You can take your pick. I'm sorry, folks, I don't have enough faith to believe that story. But if I could pause for a moment and gripe for a minute, I think we're giving them too much when we agree to talk about puddles and chemicals. Before we can talk about that, I think these folks need to first talk about where the puddle came from and where the planet on the puddle came from and where the universe in which it all existed came from. And listen, you don't get to talk about Big Bang, because in order for there to be a Big Bang, you got to have something to blow up, matter, and you have to have energy for that explosion. You have to have some kind of a trigger to cause that explosion. Before we talk about finches, before we talk about puddles, let's talk about the beginning. So let's turn another chapter. Talk about one final piece of their story. How did it all begin? Now, I could tell you what their story is, but I think it would be so much more helpful to let one of their own speak for himself. So I got a little video clip I want to show you. The speaker is Richard Dawkins. Is he probably the most famous atheist in the world today? Has written extensively mocking Christianity. And in this particular clip, he's going to tell you how everything got started. You see what you think.
Of course it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. You can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
Literally nothing. If you press Professor Krauss, he admits that he's not really talking about nothing. He himself says, and I quote, "By nothing, I don't mean nothing."
Nothing isn't nothing anymore in physics.
Nothing isn't nothing anymore in physics.
There could be literally nothing, from which something suddenly springs. And I mean, it is very hard to grasp it, and I certainly can't grasp it.
Did y'all notice that the audience laughs at him at one point? I wonder why. It isn't just because they disagree with him. It isn't even just because they think what he has proposed is wrong. They're laughing because what he has proposed is so absurd that it becomes funny. How did it all begin? The most famous atheist in the world says, our theory is that out of nothing came something. What do you think about that? When has anybody ever observed that happening and not been hospitalized afterwards? What scientific data do we have to back up the something from nothing theory? Where has that been replicated in a laboratory somewhere? Who did the study? Who was the doctor? Where did he publish his findings? Of course it hasn't been. We all know that. In fact, we all know it so well, it's so logically programmed in us that for someone to come along and say, well, you know, here's the beginning. First there was nothing, and then out of that came something that if someone said that, we would laugh. I want you to understand the problem. This isn't just their current theory. This is all they've got. If you decide that there is no God, and science has proven that matter and energy have not always been around, they're not eternal, they haven't always existed, there had to be a beginning, and God's not it, this isn't just the current possibility, it's all that's left. They don't get to argue, we're still working on that. There's nothing to work on. Something from nothing. So what do we have? This is the atheist story. That out of nothing came something. And then formed this perfect place for life to exist, and then life formed in the puddle purely by natural forces, then over billions of years evolved into what we see today. Or, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You see, folks, there really is a creation myth. There really is a story being told that doesn't have science to support it, that at points is absolutely illogical, even silly, and yet people still believe it because they just want it to be true. And it is not the story you guys have been told in Bible class. And it is not the story that is told in Genesis. It's the story they're telling in science class. The evolution story is blindly believed by people who just want it to be true. Don't be one of those people. Now, someone says, well, if it's so very clear, then why doesn't everyone believe Genesis? Can I go back to the aliens for a minute? Listen, y'all kind of giggled when I put the aliens up there and giggled at the alien argument, but I want to tell you something. The alien argument is very revealing. It shows us that this isn't really about evidence, because if it was about evidence, nobody's believing the alien argument, okay? Why are they willing to embrace people from outer space but not God? And the answer is very simple. I don't have to be accountable to an alien's not here, but if there is a God, I have to be accountable to him. I have to do what he says. It's not about the evidence, it's about the implications. So, question for me and you, I'll get with you afterwards. Question for me and you is, we believe in God. I bet that was true, everybody who came in here tonight. You believe Genesis. But do I do what the great Creator said? Have I obeyed his gospel and become his child? And if I have, am I faithfully serving him? Because I believe in the super intellect, the great Creator who spoke the universe into existence. Maybe your life doesn't match up with what you believe. And maybe you need to do something about that tonight. So Greg's going to lead us in a song. It's a great song. I didn't even think about how well this would tie in exactly with what we're going to do. We want you to pledge allegiance to the Lamb, to commit that you're going to be faithful and serve the Savior who came from the God who exists. If you need to do that, make your way to the front right now while we stand, while we sing.
We pledge allegiance to the Lamb, our great